Alright, so today we're going to be looking at how to actually review the free response questions for the AP Computer Science exam. We're going to be looking at the 2015 released exam, so we can use that as a sample. We're going to go through all of the questions, and then we're going to go through and review each of the questions using those processes that we talked about earlier in the lecture about how to actually take a look at the entire free response question. Then we're going to take a look at an updated version of a 2003 question and see how to actually apply that process to go through and answer the question step by step, looking at the component pieces of it and writing that down as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started. Here we have the 2015 free response questions. As you can see, it's released from the College Board website, so this is where the information is coming from. We're going to go ahead and take a look at these questions using that process we talked about earlier, looking at the actual structure. We're going to go through the entire set of questions, using that to actually go through. It's like that 7-minute step that we go through at the very beginning. So taking a look at how to actually go through all the questions. So looking over our thing has a nice little reminder for us as we start the program that we want to make sure that we're using Java for the language in this, that we have access to that Java quick reference at the beginning of our test itself we have access to. And when we're actually calling the methods that are attached to the code with this, we can assume that everything is not null and that they're only called when their preconditions are satisfied. So we're not going to crash our own program that we're giving you to work with. And so again, we also have a little reminder right here saying that you may use any of the accessible methods that are listed in these classes. So in the stack of stuff that we have, any of the questions that are available to them inside itself, we have access to all the code that's within it, provided it's public, of course. And then there's a nice little reminder that we have if we write significant amounts of code that are replaced by a call to one of these existing methods, that you will not receive full credit, aka you will receive a point deduction. So -1 out of your 9 points for that individual question. So you want to make sure that we use those methods as necessary within it. So we're going to go ahead and start looking at this. Our first question right here is the DiverseArray question from 2015. As you can see, we're going to look at the idea of we're going to underline the things that we need to do, circle the actions that or objects we have, and then go from there. So we're going to write some 3 static methods, so underlining that, and all of which are a single enclosing class called DiverseArray, not shown, so we're just writing the methods for it, not the individual class as a whole. And the first method is going to return the sum of the values. The second method returns an array, and it represents the sum of the values of that 2-dimensional array. And that third method will analyze row sums. So we have our quick little question right here. Scanning through it, we see it's a static method array sum that calculates and returns the entries in a specified 1D array. And it gives us a sample right here called R1 with a value of 16 as its total value. Again, we want to make sure that we note that the idea that this is simply just a sample. We do not code for spots 0 through 4 or expect a return of 16. We want to actually call the parameter as specified inside our method and not refer only to this sample right here. R1 is simply a sample. Don't use that for the code. We look over at the question itself, and we have our complete method array sum below, and we have our public static int array sum. Because this is an int method, we can do that process we talked about in the video where we immediately declare a variable of the type, in this case call an int of sum, and assign a value of 0 to it, having a semicolon. And for our final line of code, we write return sum, simply just getting that framework immediately. We're not writing any of the code yet, we're simply going through and getting that framework ready to go. We then look on to our next question. We're going to take a look at that. We have a static method of row sums that calculates the sums of each of the rows in a given 2D array. So we're using a 2D array for that, and returns these sums in a 1D array. So we're going to have a 1D array that's going to be returned for that we will make sure we identify. We have some information about this. It's a row major order, and the rate R2D, RC is the entry at row R and column C. And we want to make sure that when we're specifying this, that we return a 1-dimensional array with 1 entry for each row of R2D. So we're going to have an array that is as big as how many rows they have. And so we have this sample right here of mat1, and we want to make sure that we don't refer to mat1 inside our actual code, but if we were to have a variable called mat1, we'd refer to mat1 sub 0.length rather than rows 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, but that way we can get the number of columns for that, or we want to use mat1.length to get each of our rows 0 through 3. We have a reference to all the methods that are available to us again, so we can use that as a nice little hint as we go through and write our code. Again, we have the idea of making a method for this. We're assuming that array sum works as specified, regardless of what we wrote in part A. So that means we must use array sum appropriately to receive full credit. So that tells us immediately that we need to use that method from our previous class. We have a public static int method. It's an int array method, so we know we're going to declare an int array. In this case, I call int array sums, semicolon, declaring the variable. The next line would be to initialize that immediately, and so we would say that sums equals a new int array, and we are past the array 2D as that, and then we know that we're going to have the number of rows, so we do the R2D dot length, which will give us the number of rows for the size of that new array. immediately creating that. And in our final line of code, again, returning the sum. So we, again, even though we haven't written any code, we declare the variable, initialize with the appropriate size, and return that immediately. We're not actually looking at the logic attached. We'll come back and hit that after we've gone through and looked at all the questions. Again, we have our third part of this question, which is the part C, which tells us about some information about it. It says it's diverse, and here's a couple samples of information. As we can see, we're writing a method called isDiverse that gives a two-dimensional array. It has one single parameter so that we know we have to use it, which is a 2D array of int values. The method should return true if all the row sums are unique, otherwise it returns false. Because we're dealing with a true or false, we know we're going to be dealing with a Boolean method, so we'll declare that immediately and go from there. It talks about this, that isDiverse mat2 returns false because there are two copies, 14, that have the same value. So we'll go ahead and move past that, take a look at the actual question. Again, it's a Boolean method. It takes a parameter of R2D. It's a 2D array. And again, we start off by simply just writing that quick little blurb that defining a variable of the type Boolean, matching a return type of our method, assigning a variable name, and assigning a good and valid default value, in this case false. We assume it won't work first, and we return diverse, giving us space to actually write the answer for our question. Looking at question 2, we're going to try and guess a hidden word. The hidden word contains only capital letters, so nice little bit of information to remember, and it has a length that is known to the player, so we know that information already. We don't have to assume anything on that. A guess will also contain only capital letters and has the same length as this. Okay, we have that ready to go. We have some information about the actual structure of the question. If it matches the word, it's the same. If the words match each other, you have the matching letter. If it's in there but a different spot, it's a plus, and if it's not in there at all, we get simply an asterisk. We have a hidden word class we use to represent the hidden word. A hidden word is passed to the constructor, so we know that our constructor will have a parameter. This class contains a method called getHint that takes a guess and produces a hint, so it takes a string and returns a string. For example, suppose the variable puzzle is defined as follows. We have a variable puzzle of type hidden word. We construct it using the constructor call of passing it harps. This calls the getHint method. As we can see, that we have a string that is passed to our getHint method, and a string is returned from that method as well. So it's a string method with a string parameter. We look at our instructions, and it tells us to write a complete hidden word class, including necessary instance variables, a constructor, and the method getHint as described above. And then it also lets us know we can assume the length is known. So had this been the actual exam, we would have a lot more space, but because this is simply just the printed copy off the website, they do try and conserve some paper. So we flip this over right here, and we can see that we have a public class hidden word, giving our open and closing squiggles right here. In our declaration section, we declare a private string word, so we can have a value for that. We know that our constructor takes a string word as a parameter. We will know, of course, that we need to initialize that inside our constructor, but again, we're simply just writing that framework as we get started. We have also heard that we have a public string method called getHint that takes a string as a guess, and that we have a hint that will be returning, so we initialize that hint as a blank set of parameters of string, a semicolon, and return that string. So we automatically returning a value, so it'll compile, even if we have to take some time to add it in the code that goes along with this, any getters or any of the methods as necessary. We have our framework code ready to go for the question. Our third question is talking about SparseArray entries. We look at the actual question right here, and we can see that we are going to be dealing with a SparseArray entry object. Here is the complete SparseArray, and we have a note right here that this object cannot be modified after it has been constructed. We can see that by the fact that there are no setters after the getters right here. It is simply just that getter, and the note right here that this is a complete class. There is nothing else in this class. This class is given to us. We don't have a note saying other methods are not shown. So we know right here that we can simply create an object and use the getters to access the variables, but not actually change them. We then have our SparseArray class, which has an array list or list of sparse entry objects called entries that we'll be using inside that. The fact that we have a data member, again, clues us that we will be using this. We also have data members for a number of rows and columns that we'll keep track of. We look through this. We have our constructor. We have our getNumRows and getNumColumn method. We have the initialization of our array list as necessary. And we finally have over here, we have two methods, part A and part B, that we'll be implementing. As you can see right here in part A, we're going to be implementing the getValueAt that takes two parameters, a row and column, and returns an integer. And we have our part B question where we'll be taking a void method that takes a single column as a parameter to remove a column. Looking over part A, we have some information that presents for us. We have the idea that we have the SparseArray object called sparse, and there's entries are in no particular order, so the order itself does not matter in the list when we take them, use them or take them out. And we have 6 rows, 5 columns, and here are the entries for this. We have a method we're going to be writing called getValueAt. It returns the value of the SparseArray provided the given row